Chapter 22 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 22 Metal Fakes. Metalwork. The bronze family, brass, copper and their various colours and patinae. Beaten ironwork. Arms and armour. Artificial rust and chemical oxidation. When the imitators of arms and armour used steel and when iron. Cast iron pieces. Chemical tests. Difficulties in the connoisseurship of arms and the story of three shields. Old and modern imitations. Silverwork. Its colour and oxidization. Why artistic pieces in precious metal are in danger of being destroyed. Fashion one of the dangers of silver plate. How far reliance may be placed in marks. Goldwork. The tiara of Satyaphernes. Jewels and their extreme rarity. Imitations and forgeries of all ages. Advice to the non-initiated in the art of buying jewels. When speaking in another part of this work about the methods of conferring an appearance of age to newly cast bronze, we remarked that the faker's best accomplice in the ageing process was chemistry. The colouring and bronzing of metals, in fact, is usually accomplished by one of two methods, by the action of chemicals or by the application of bronze powders rendered impalpable and used as a pigment. The latter method is mostly used in modern industrial art, but has, nevertheless, been applied in imitating antiques and in disguising mended parts, etc. It is often used with success in the case of imitations of excavated objects, which generally have a bluish green patina. This may be imitated to deceive the eye of the beginner only, by the application of green bronze lacquer of a dull lustre, or of green varnish. The green of the bronze colour is best prepared by mixing Frankfurt black with chrome yellow. These are, however, but cheap and not always convincing expedients. The real way to give tone and colour to bronze and other metals is by resort to chemistry. A brown colour on bronze, for instance, may be obtained by preparing a sand bath large enough to contain the article to be bronzed. When the object has been cleansed from all grease, by dipping in boiling potash lye, it is treated with white vinegar. After this preliminary operation the object is wiped thoroughly dry and then rubbed with a linen rag moistened with hydrochloric acid. When this coating is perfectly dry, a quarter of an hour is sufficient, the article must be heated in the sand bath until it has acquired a bluish tint, then a final rubbing with a linen rag soaked in olive oil will change the blue colour to brown. Recipes and processes are endless and so rich in hues that almost any tone may be obtained. To any interested in this branch of imitating old methods, we can but suggest the excellent book, The Metal Worker's Handy Book, edited by William T. Brandt. As we have said, there are many methods by which to give the proper patina to metals, and a good deal of mystery, some fakers and imitators claiming to be in possession of unrevealed secrets. When exposed to the air for a long time, copper and bronze acquire a fine brown or green patina, which, as every collector knows, greatly enhances the merits of an artistic piece in these two metals. A perfect imitation of the result of a long process of time is not an easy matter, in fact an almost impossible task. Formerly the patina of a bronze was in a way the final test of authenticity, but nowadays there are modern imitations of so deceptive a character that the best connoisseurs are taken in. One of the best known methods by which old patina is imitated on copper and bronze is to follow as closely as possible the process by which the genuine patina is produced. Thus the action of rain, interment, immersion in some permeating substance that will generate hydrosulphuric acid are called into service by those willing to wait a comparatively long time for the desired effects. Others accelerate the above process by increasing the proportion of the natural conducive elements. The objects are also treated with water containing ammonia, carbonic acid, etc., exposed to the intense and direct action of vapour or vaporized acid in order to produce those basic salts that form a certain patina. To obtain the malachite kind of patina that generally characterizes objects found in the ground, the imitator generally brushes the metal over with a very weak solution of cupric nitrate, to which a small quantity of common salt in solution may be added. When completely dry it is again brushed over with a liquid consisting of 100 parts of weak vinegar, 5 of sal ammoniac and 1 of oxalic acid, and the application is repeated after the first has dried. In about a week's time the metal will have acquired a green-brown colour that may be polished with encaustic if the patina is to have a shiny appearance. Such is the leitmotif, more or less, of the processes of obtaining the green or brown-green patinae. Some dip the object in cupric acid and then place it in a room in which an excess of carbonic acid is produced. By others preference is given to one or the other elements according to the tone and colour desired. Brass articles are coated with green patina by solutions containing 150 parts of vinegar to which has been added 10 parts of copper dissolved in 20 of nitric acid. An application of this liquid is generally made on the object. The brown patina usually characterizing old medals is obtained in many ways. One is by heating the medal at the flame of a spirit lamp and then brushing it with graphites. To colour a number of medals at the same time, some imitators dissolve 30 parts of verdigris and 30 parts of sal ammoniac in 10 of water, adding water to the solution until a precipitate is no longer formed. Then the medals are placed in a shallow dish without touching one another and the boiling solution is poured over them. The medals are allowed to remain in the solution till they have acquired the desired tint, which should be a fine brown. Green or bluish patinae may also be given to bronze or copper by triturated copper carbonate used as a paint with a pale spirit varnish, shellac or sandarac and applied with a brush. Verdigris generally gives a bluish tint and crystallized verdigris a pale green tint. The two tones can be mingled to obtain some special hue. Ironwork is perhaps one of the easiest to imitate and give an appearance of antiquity. As far as the actual work is concerned, it rests entirely upon the skill and artistic taste of the worker. Patina on iron is either caused simply by rust or by a slow process of oxidation which confers a rich, dark tone to iron. There is also a special patina seen on iron that has been under water for a long time, but this is rare in imitations and very difficult to obtain. The rusty coating on iron can be produced by almost any preparation capable of oxidizing the surface or transforming it into basic salt provided a red colour results, as with nitric or hydrochloric acid for instance. The brown patina is often obtained by oiling the piece and exposing it to the direct action of flame. The two methods may be alternated and the corrosion of the acid here and there adds character to the piece. Methods are so various, however, that the way to obtain a convincing patina is perhaps contained in the dictum of an Italian antiquary to inflict upon the object that is to be turned into an antique every possible indignity and abuse. The patina in imitations of old ironwork is so well reproduced nowadays that even experts are unable to distinguish the real from the unreal with certainty, so much so that more than one has had recourse to an analysis of the composition of the iron in order to decide whether the object were modern or antique. This justifies the verdict of Moreau, an expert and celebrated artist in iron, who, when called upon to decide whether a certain artistic key exhibited at the Paris World Exhibition of 1878 were really of ancient workmanship, replied that he could not tell unless he were allowed to break the key and examine the grain of iron. Italy is one of the countries where the imitation of old iron is traditional. In olden times it was the work of Caparra and other artists of the Renaissance that were imitated. Nowadays old models are reproduced for the benefit of the tourist, and some are conceived in the old style with extreme perfection for those collectors who go in for originals and who buy this modern work as genuine chefs d'œuvre of the Quattrocento and Cinquecento. Florence, Venice and the town of Urbino furnish the Italian market with the best imitations of old candelabra, andirons, gates, lamps and keys. In fact, everything that is likely to attract the tourist or please the collector. Nearly every country possesses good imitators of artistic old iron, which is perhaps due to the fact that such imitations do not require any great artistic ability, nor is the coat of rust on modern iron a matter incurring expense or complicated methods. The most difficult in this field are the imitations of arms of all kinds, which require a skilful workman and often a finished artist in ironwork. In this particular branch of faking it is not only a question of reproducing old weapons of a national character, but the forger frequently turns his attention to imitating arms of exotic type. We all know that Constantinople is the place par excellence for imitations of old Oriental arms and armour, but very few are aware that when they buy an Oriental poniard or Turkish gun ornamented with passages from the Koran in Africa, for instance, they are buying goods made in Germany. As a matter of fact, however, German factories supply Oriental maritime markets with all their fine arms. We still recollect the amazement of an American tourist who on returning from a fair near Tangiers showed the hotel keeper his find, a fine Morocco knife with a carved scabbard in brass, and was told that it was German. As he persisted in his incredulity the hotel keeper showed him the mate of his bargain, which had been presented to him by the German commercial traveller who had lodged in his hotel. As usual, collectors of the genre being diverse as to taste and calibre as connoisseurs, the accommodating faker has goods to suit the varied scale of his clients, or rather there are fakers of arms and armour, like the Venetian rubbish, which is for easily pleased greenhorns, and others producing fine goods for the man of exquisite taste, such as the product of Vienna, Belgium, France and sundry Italian artists of forged steel. We have purposefully made a distinction by saying sundry Italian artists, because while the imitation of arms in other countries assumes the character of factory work of extremely good quality, in Italy the artist who forges steel, chisels it and imitates old weapons is usually a solitary worker in his own home, a fact that makes him far more dangerous to the collector. These artists are often simply imitators of the old style whose work is sold by others as antique. One of them used to live in Lucca, whose imitations of old daggers Cinque Dei or Lingue di Bove have become famous. Another in a town of northern Italy imitates Negroli and Milanese work with uncommon success. Many of these artists, who imitated and copied old damascened work to perfection, with no thought of cheating, have executed fine work that can stand upon its own merit so to say. Such for instance is the work of Zuloaga, the father of the painter of that name, and of another Spaniard of repute in the artistic world, Mariano Fortuny. This excellent painter was also a first-rate chiseller and good artist in damascened work. He imitated the Moresque style to perfection. At the sale that took place after his death, one of his reproductions, a damascened sword, fetched the price of 15,000 francs and was sold with no other recommendation than that of being a modern imitation of the antique by Mariano Fortuny. In a letter written to the well-known amateur Baron de Villiers, Fortuny speaks of a flourishing factory near his studio in which excellent imitations of armour were made, chiefly repoussé swords. It may be taken for granted that if such a judge as Fortuny called the imitation of this Roman work excellent, some of them are at present enriching well-known collections. There is a scarcity of genuine pieces on the market, in fact hardly a single fine Cinquecento sword or halberd is to be seen in shops now or is for sale. The few still obtainable are poor specimens as a rule, and this fact ought to put the neophyte on his guard when he is offered some gorgeously ornamented sword, pike, ranseur or partisan lavishly chased and gilded. Some years ago an elegant lady was asked why the fair sex preferred to dress elaborately rather than in the stylish simplicity of tailor-made gowns, to which she replied, "Perhaps because it is less expensive." In a way the fine plain swords and unornamented pieces of armour are more difficult to fake. They would seem to demand the same eye for form as a perfect cut, well-fitting, simple tailor-made gown. This, combined with the collector's cheap taste in arms, may be the reason why the faker gives preference to imitations loaded with chased or damascened ornamentation, and enriched with gilding and elaborate arabesques. The rarity of imitations of fine weapons characterized by elegant lines, simplicity and sobriety of ornament, suggested to the author some years ago the solution to a difficult problem propounded by Baron Nathaniel Rothschild. When called to Baron Rothschild's magnificent mansion in Vienna, I found this rich and sagacious collection had received two fine swords that were being offered for sale. One was simplicity itself, the other over-ornamented and lavishly gilded on blade and hilt. Which do you advise me to buy? I must decide between the two." To be frank, they both looked genuine to me, but the Baron's question roused a suspicion in my mind that one of the two swords was a forgery. "I should buy this one," I answered, pointing to the sword almost deprived of ornament. "You have a good eye," complimented the Baron. "The other sword is an imitation, one of the most admirable I have ever seen." My discernment, however, was merely based on the accepted aphorism that the combination in art of simplicity and extreme elegance is difficult to imitate, otherwise who knows but what I might not have selected the faked sword. It must be added here that an imitation can very rarely bear close comparison with a genuine piece. The proximity of the genuine article is always rather disastrous to the fake, and never more so than in the case of arms and armour. This may be accounted for by the difference in the modern methods of working and ornamenting steel. These methods not only produce a difference in the raw and worked steel that connoisseurs claim to distinguish, but the ornamentation itself is wrought by other means. Engraved ornaments, especially on pieces that do not aim to deceive first-rate connoisseurs, are rarely done by the old method, but preferably by acids. Damascening, such as is rarely done now even in the East, was a skilful and complicated operation by which steel blades and armours were inlaid with gold or silver ornamentations. The designs were first cut deep into the steel with a burin, then the gold or silver was beaten in with a hammer, not only until the surface was smooth, but until the inset was securely worked into and held by all the irregularities of the groove. Such work is now imitated by gilding over a rather shallow groove obtained by the action of nitric acid. The sombre shine of old steel is generally reproduced by a thin coat of encaustic. The sum total of these differences, together with a certain loss of artistic sense in the art, are the causes perhaps of the most disastrous effect upon fakery of a close proximity with genuineness, as above noted. This of course is in common cases, for, as we have said, there are sporadic workers in steel who produce pieces that baffle the best connoisseurs. As an artistic object cannot always be tested by breaking it and examining the texture of the metal, which would be the safest method at present. Here again we are forced to advise the newcomer in the field of connoisseurship, during his search for arms in his first enthusiastic stage, to use more than one grain of salt with what he hears, and several pounds of scepticism when he comes across what would seem to be a real find. For over 30 years arms, we mean fine specimens, have practically disappeared from the market. Pistols, guns and weapons of a late epoch may still be seen, but not swords of the Quattrocento and early Cinquecento. Also in this field the semi-faked article has the usual luck of fetching a good price with the majority of collectors. Plain old pistols are often embellished with all kinds of most seductive additions. Mottos are engraved or inlaid in silver on blades originally simple but deprived of the elegant simplicity to which we have already alluded. These, however, are the cheap articles of the trade, but the story of 3 shields, a well-known incident still recounted among Paris collectors, offers ample proof that there are also in this field imitations that defy the best connoisseurs, as we have already said and gladly repeat, in order to render our warning to the novice all the more emphatic. One of these skilled imitators flourished several years ago in Italy's chief rival in antiquities and faking. We refer of course to Spain. The first of the 3 identical shields, all of which came to Paris, was palmed off on Mr. Didier Petit, an excellent connoisseur, who paid the good round sum of £400 for this fine piece of imitation. It was repoussé work with a mythological subject in the centre, Jove fulminating the Titans. The person to be struck down really, however, was poor Mr. Didier Petit, rather than the Titans, for on realizing that he had been fooled he died of grief or apoplexy, brought on by his delusion and wounded pride as a connoisseur. Under the auctioneer's hammer at a subsequent sale, the famous shield fetched £20. The second, of identical make, was very nearly passed off on Baron de Villiers, perhaps the most esteemed connoisseur of his time. Baron de Villiers was offered the rare piece in Spain. He was struck at first by its beauty and appearance of authenticity, as well as the plausible story by which the owner explained his possession of such a valuable object. The bargain was struck at £320, and, happy over his piece of good luck, Baron de Villiers, like a true collector, hastened to convey his find safely to his home in Paris. Noticing at the custom house that the official treated his precious find with indifference, he became suspicious, and his suspicion of having been cheated grew to certainty before the end of the journey. It would take long to recount the circumstances by which Baron de Villiers recovered his £320. Suffice it to say that he did recover them, and the Spaniard replaced the faked shield in the panoply from whence the Baron had taken it down, swearing all the time that it was genuine, even though the Baron had seen another like it, that there might be twins among articles of virtu, etc. But there was still the third of the shield triplet fated to come to Paris, bought by the well-known expert called, or rather nicknamed, Couvreur. Curiously enough, this third expert from one and the same city was also a specialist in arms, as Baron de Villiers might have been considered, had his immense knowledge not conferred upon him the character of a specialist in almost every branch of connoisseurship. Where did Couvreur buy this third shield? From the very man who tried to cheat Baron de Villiers. It appears that it was not the same shield as the Baron's, though of identical workmanship, for there were trifling differences between it and the fake No. 2 to reach Paris. Couvreur had paid a fine price for his find, £800. He never recovered his money and created a scandal by presenting the piece for exhibition at the World Show of 1878, insulting the judges upon their refusal to place it among the genuine pieces. Thus he lived and died maintaining that all who believed the piece to be a fake were fools. This story only goes to prove that in every branch of imitation or faking there exist some artists of unusual talent able almost to attain perfection. Those who remember the story of the famous Gladius Rogieri, quoted by Paul Yuval in his amusing book Le Truquage, and all the discussion held in court over this supposed sword of the valiant King Robert of Sicily, are aware of how a good connoisseur such as M. Basilewski and a well-informed dealer like M. Novilos can be taken in by a fine piece of faking, and how a legion of experts may give contrary evidence as to the authenticity of an object. And if this could happen in Paris, one of the most enlightened cities as to connoisseurship, and among a coterie of specialists, it may be imagined what possibilities for deception are offered by America, that El Dorado of fakers. While speaking of first-rate imitations by fakers conscientious enough to use steel, we may add that there are successful imitations in which iron and cast iron have been substituted for the orthodox metal of weapons. The learned Demon declares that the casting, which forgery has made it very difficult to recognize, is a source of no little embarrassment to collectors. He suggests that when there is a suspicion that a piece is cast, an unimportant part of it should be filed and, as usual, the texture of the material be examined. If under the magnifying glass the grain appears coarser and very shiny, the piece has been cast. To tell iron from steel, Demon suggests that a drop of sulphuric acid diluted with water should be applied. If the action of this liquid turns the metal black, it is steel. If a greenish mark is made that can be easily washed away with water, then it is iron. The black stain is produced on steel because the acid eats into the iron and not the carbon contained in the composition of steel. Before closing the topics of arms and armour, we may observe that marks on these pieces, whether engraved or impressed, are hardly a guarantee, as marks can be easily imitated on these articles as on any other kind of artistic imitation. In the case of weapons they have even been imitated by workers contemporary with the artist they fraudulently copy, in order to take advantage of the high reputation of certain marks. The work of a Missaglia, Domenico or Filippo Negroli, however, is not only attested by the stamped name, or sigla, but by the inimitable sum total of their art. Many imitators have made a great study of copying impressed marks, but have neglected or failed to copy the individual characteristics that bear witness to an artist as much as his signature. In the imitation and faking of ancient art in its various branches, the methods and the results all differ so little that we fear to grow monotonous in this brief sketch of the questionable trade when now entering another class of metalwork, that of silver and gold. The precious metals require no recipes for patinæ, as patinæ play no part. This is especially so in the case of gold, but as naive collectors of all branches of art present the same idiosyncrasies, it is evident that the general trend of trickery in the human comedy is more or less identical, when allowance is made for the different materials peculiar to each particular art. Indeed, the whole matter might be reduced to a simple equation with no unknown quantity, namely a fool on one side and on the other a fraud which works out to a positive and disastrous result for the former. In the case of silver, although there is not exactly a question of patina properly so called, there is certainly a question of colouring or oxidizing, for old silver, as everyone knows, never keeps the brightly shining appearance of a new piece. It rather improves with time by the acquisition of a low, pleasing tonality which has a most favourable effect, a sort of pleasing light and shade, which the flat negative shininess of a new piece rarely possesses. In England the conservatism of the upper classes has preserved some really genuine silver articles, with duly authenticated pedigree. In France the spirit of the Revolution may be possible to a certain extent for the scarcity of rich pieces of artistic silver. Only long before the ruit hora of the Revolution various circumstances had rendered the life of artistic silver precarious, risks to which all artistic objects in precious metals are liable. Many pieces of silver, in fact, were coined into money during Louis XIV's time, when the state became a financial wreck under the glorious reign of the Roi Soleil. Changing fashion and taste also, combined with the fact that the silver was for use and not collections, contributed to the destruction of old types of silver plate to make way for new ones more in keeping with the new forms dictated by fashion or altered taste. To the combined effect of financial distress and changing taste Italy also owes the destruction of old silver that would otherwise have come down to us intact, just as nowadays plated silver is likely to pass undisturbed from one generation to another. It is not uncommon in Italy to hear that some aristocratic family had ancient silver melted down a few years ago to make new and commonplace tablespoons and forks. A lady from Siena who did this for a whim kept one piece of the old silver service and was much astonished to learn later that this one piece alone would have fetched a sum sufficient to buy the coveted new set of table silver. In Italy, and more especially in Tuscany, the heavy taxes levied by Napoleon during the occupation forced many Florentine families to get rid of their silver plate. As a matter of fact, in Italy and elsewhere fine pieces are very rare nowadays, yet a few years ago fickle fashion helped several people of good taste to form excellent collections, gatherings of artistic pieces that the art lover would seek in vain today. That was the happy time when old fashioned and yet artistic silver was hardly reckoned above the intrinsic value of the metal it contained. 50 or so years ago it was not uncommon for one of the few collectors of artistic silver to come across some artistic beauty offered at so much a gramme, generally a very moderate figure slightly above the current price of the metal, or at times the actual value of the silver. To quote one instance out of many, in 1855 at the sale held after the death of Mademoiselle Mazencourt, some particularly fine flambeaux and other pieces of silver were sold at the price of 20 centimes a gramme. Such conditions explain how Baron Pichon, a collector of taste, was able to buy for the moderate sum of 300 francs an artistic bowl which was sold at his death for 14,000 francs, a price that could easily be surpassed nowadays. Unfortunately for the true collector, not only has old silver become fashionable, but it has become fashionable to be a collector of artistic silver, and thus real connoisseurship and ignorant greedy wealth have started the usual competition that inevitably creates an artificial standard of values, all too apt to general faking. Faked silver, in fact, came at once triumphantly to the front in forms of all kinds. Entirely new pieces successfully paraded as old were launched upon the market, as well as plain old pieces decked out with the heavy ornamentation likely to suit the taste of the parvenu. There were also the usual piecemeal of different authentic parts, joined together more or less harmoniously by modern work, in fact all that the faker's genius and versatility is able to produce. Silver marks which on genuine pieces guarantee the quality of the metal and the authenticity of the piece as the work of a certain artist, factory or mint, can unfortunately be imitated with success. In fact, the faker who is a good psychologist and knows that the neophyte amateur relies largely upon his knowledge of marks, generally expends great care upon the imitation of the various hallmarks. Though, as we have already said, silver has no patina, properly so called, there is the tone and colour which has to be imitated. To dull silver, to give it, we mean, the leaden brownish colour acquired by age, a mixture of sulphur or chlorine is used. A solution of pentasulphide of potassium, the liver of sulphur of the shops, is generally used. Liver of sulphur is prepared by thoroughly mixing and heating together 2 parts of well dried potash and 1 of sulphur powder. This mixture also takes effect on cupriferous silver, but the result is not so fine. A velvety black is obtained by dipping the article in a solution of mercurious nitrate previous to oxidization. This method is used when a half polish is to be given to the silver, leaving the dark tones in the grooves. Another method consists of dipping the article in chlorine water, a solution of chloride of lime, or into eau de javel. Special works on metal also give many other methods, and it is for the imitator to choose the best adapted for the particular case and to use his artistic criterion to obtain a convincing effect. Passing on to gold, more especially in jewellery, we may say that imitators and fakers have wrought havoc by filling the market with spurious products. Imitation in this branch ranges from copying the old art of working gold, of which the famous tiara of Sapiens, bought by the Louvre, is one of the most striking examples, to the small piece of jewellery which imitated enamels or more or less genuine stones. In this line there is something to suit all tastes, from the eager connoisseur, difficult to please, still on the lookout for the marvellous jewellery of the Renaissance and early 16th century, to the less exclusive, satisfied with later epochs, down to the 18th century. There is no way of helping the neophyte to collect jewellery, not only because fine old pieces are extremely rare, but because no advice or theoretical hints can help the discernment of the genuine article, only sound and well tested experience, gained often at great cost, is of any real avail. In this branch also there are imitations that are entirely new and others, like the above said tiara, that have become such by the preponderance of restored parts or because the latter are the most important artistically speaking. In the tiara of Sapiens, the genuine part, if genuine, is the upper portion of the domed tiara, which is said to have been an ancient drinking cup reversed and placed at the top of the tiara. Many well imitated rings are really old worn out rings used for the circle to show that they have been used, on which the artistic setting of the jewel or other ornamented part has been soldered. In conclusion, when you would buy old jewellery, buy as if it were modern and pay the price of imitations. Then if by some rare chance you are mistaken, you will experience the unique pleasure of possessing a "find," but never reverse the process, for if you buy an ancient piece of jewellery you will certainly realize in due time that it is really modern. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 23. Woodwork and Musical Instruments. Carved wood. Artistic furniture. Wood staining and patina. The merits of elbow grease. Painted and lacquered furniture. Veneer and inlaid work. Musical instruments. Imitations and fakers of musical instruments. Connoisseurship of musical instruments twofolds. Attribution and labels. Some good imitators. The violin as example. The restoration and odd adventures of well-known musical instruments. Legends and anecdotes that help. Analysis of form and of sound. Rossini's saying. The finest pieces of faked furniture are very rarely entirely new. Sometimes they are old pieces to which rich ornaments have been added. At other times, and this is the most common occurrence, they are put together from fragments belonging to 2, 3 or even 4 different pieces, the parts and débris, in fact, of old broken furniture. There is also the entirely new fake imitating old furniture, but this is rarely as convincing as the other, which is the really dangerous type even for an experienced collector. Impressed by the great amount of faked furniture glutting the Paris market, Paul Yuval says, "In principle there is no more such a thing as antique furniture. All that is sold is false or terribly repaired." In Italy, that inexhaustible mine of past art, it is still possible to find genuine pieces, provided, of course, that the collector does not insist upon having those first rate pieces now belonging to museums or collections formed several years ago. There are, however, in Italy, as in every other country, modern productions of antique furniture for the novices in the collector's career. This furniture may be carved out of old pieces of wood or ordinary wood. In both cases it is generally necessary to give an old colouring to the wood, for which there are a variety of methods according to the desired effect, tone, colour, etc. Many use walnut juice, others permanganate of potash, and still others the more drastic system of burning the surface of the wood with acid. The old way of imitating wormholes was to use buckshot, a ridiculous method which nevertheless had its vogue, and apparently satisfied the gross eye of some collectors. Nowadays wormholes are made with an instrument that imitates them to perfection, although they do not go so deep as the genuine ones, and this difference, by the way, is one of the tests to tell real wormholes from spurious ones. As new furniture that imitates old is generally too sharp-edged and neatly furnished, it is usually subjected to a regular course of ill treatment. French dealers call this process "aviler un meuble," and it consists of pounding with heavy sticks, rubbing with sandpaper, pumice, etc. The finishing touch, that peculiar polished surface characterizing ancient furniture, is usually given by friction with wool after a slight coating of benzene in which a little wax has been dissolved. The less wax used and the more elbow grease, the more will the polish resemble that of real old furniture, and the more difficult does it become to detect the deceit. If much wax has been used, the scratch of a needle is sufficient to reveal even the thinnest layer, but if it is so imperceptible as to stand this test it is very difficult to tell the real from the imitation. The polished parts of an old piece of furniture are not casual, but the result of long use. Prominent parts are naturally, therefore, the ones to get so polished rather than other parts. I remember witnessing a curious sight one day when admitted to the sanctum of a well-known antiquary. Half a dozen stools had been repaired, most generously repaired, a new patina had been given and now they were to receive the last touches, the polished parts that add such charm to old furniture. The workman who had half finished the job kept passing and repassing close to the stools which he had arranged in a row, rubbing his legs against each one. I asked him the meaning of the performance, and he answered that as there were no sharp edges on the lower parts of those 16th century walnut stools, he wanted to find out where and to what extent they would be most polished by use. Not having a genuine stool from which to copy, he had to resort to this means so as to make no mistake. I very nearly asked him if he thought every one was the same height and had the same length of leg. But as the work proceeded I gathered from the practical application of his method, better than I could have done from any explanation, that he was endeavouring to get a mere hint where to begin to rub with his pad, in order to produce that vague patch of hollows one notices sometimes in church benches. The same patience is necessary in making imitation wormholes, which are so cunningly distributed, so convincingly worked in their erratic manner of piercing wood, as to suggest to Edmond Bonnaffé the fine bit of sarcasm, "divers savants chargés de fouiller le bois neuf à la demande." That piecemeal kind of furniture, the parts of which are unquestionably antique but of various origins, being the remains of more than one piece of furniture, l'assemblage as the French call it, may prove a danger to the best connoisseurs if done well and with taste. In certain respects the piece is genuinely antique, but not exactly as the collector understands the word, hence its fraudulency entitles it to be classified among fakes. It is incredible what an industrious antiquary is able to do in the way of piecing furniture together. This consists not merely of finding a top for table legs or legs for a table top, But there is no limit to the invention of this piecemeal furniture. A wooden door may furnish the back of a throne when well matched with a rich old coffer, the gilded ornamentation of an altar may be transformed into the head of a Louis XV bed, and so on. In the same way a simple piece of furniture may be enriched by attaching ornaments, coats of arms, etc. The whole is invariably toned and harmonized by means of one of the above mentioned methods. Naturally, ignorance of style sometimes leads some fakers to extremely amusing blunders, but it must be confessed the cases are rare, and this piecemeal furniture has been palmed off on too many connoisseurs and graces too many well-reputed collections to be dismissed with a smile of incredulity. Were antiquaries more disposed to talk, or less indulged towards the conceit of collectors, it might be learned that all the rich furniture sold during the last 20 years to museums and collectors belongs to this composite order. A special branch of the imitation of antique furniture is inlaid work, the French marqueterie and Italian tassia, by which designs are traced upon the surface by inlaying wood, ivory or metal. There are various epochs and styles of inlaid furniture. One may begin with the geometrical patterns of the Trecento or the Cappuccino of about the same time and later, and gradually pass through the many styles and methods to the complex ornamentation of Boule's work. The early work, including the Cappuccino, a peculiar inlaid ivory work with geometric patterns, is very well imitated in Italy, where restorers of this kind of furniture generally turn into good imitators and become at times impenitent fakers of the most fantastic would-be old style. Skill in inlaying wood and ivory according to different epochs and the ordinary collector's love of ornamented furniture have suggested to some imitators the most absurd combinations of styles, a riot of incongruity and incompatibility. It is not rare to see fine chairs that would otherwise be tasteful but for the heavy ornamentation of inlaid wood or ivory arabesques, grotesques, etc. The outrage of having a 15th century inlaid after the style and designs of at least a century later is not uncommonly excused by the explanation that it appeals to the tawdry taste of customers and that the article commands a higher price by the addition of the heavy incongruous ornamentation. This peculiar form of degeneration in taste, the passion for excessive ornamentation, is also what often mars the imitations of the 17th and 18th century painted furniture, imitations of the Venetian style especially being generally very carelessly finished, but overcharged with gilding and cheap bits of painted ornamentation. French imitations in this line are not so debased as some Italian, but like them they are not very convincing, as it is almost impossible to imitate the 18th century gilding, and the carving of this epoch shows such neatness and is so clean cut that the gilded parts assume an appearance of metal, a quality that the modern industry of antiques does not find convenient or is unable to imitate. The French Boule is often imitated with celluloid instead of tortoiseshell, and can only succeed in attracting the very easily satisfied collector. This is the case with some other cheap imitations overcharged with ordinary gilded bronze. By the side of these specimens, however, French art also counts some excellent imitations done by real artists, which if not successful in deceiving experienced collectors are nevertheless regular chefs d'œuvre in the art of imitating the finest and richest pieces of Louis XV and Louis XVI styles. The simplicity and purity of line that characterized English styles from the end of the 17th century to the best period of the next helped to keep the imitators of this country within bounds. Their fancy in any case was less inventive and less disastrously enterprising than that of the cheap imitators of Italian furniture. Before leaving the subject we may say that many of the walnut panels in furniture, which appear to be so elaborately carved, are not carved at all but burnt into the desired patterns. The process consists of making a good cast iron matrix from a fine bas relief, then heating it and pressing it upon the wood by a special procedure by which all the superfluous wood is burnt away and the rest takes the shape of the mould. This method not only gives the wood the desired form in perfect imitation of carving, but the burning stains it to a very fine brown tone very much resembling old wood, after which an application of oil or encaustic is sufficient to give it a semblance of patina. In another part of this book we have noted that in Bologna more especially imitations of old tables are placed for a time in cheap restaurants where, through grease, dirt and rough wear and tear, they acquire that fine patina so highly esteemed in ancient wood. Such pieces are not only found in towns but are housed here and there about the country, sometimes in old palaces and villas or else in out of the way nooks. The former system gives the alluring sensation of buying something really worth while, and at first hand, from its historical owner; the latter that a real find has been discovered, that find which is the eternal fata morgana of freshman collectors. Imitations of musical instruments vary according to the style of the instrument and its musical quality. In some fakes the musical quality is of minor importance to a certain extent, the artistic properties and ornamentation being the chief consideration with the collector. In other instruments the quality of the tone is of importance, so that though the form may not be neglected, the faker must bear in mind that his imitation will have to stand a double test, it must satisfy the ear and stand the examination of an experienced eye. The first class includes collectively such instruments as are no longer in use and are highly ornamented with carving, inlaid work or gilding such as lutes, archilutes, harps, virginals, spinets, etc. The second comprises instruments that are still in use, such as violins, cellos, etc. The ornamental, strange and obsolete instruments are the ones that fakers chiefly furnish to the ordinary trade. Naturally the trade in imitating instruments for the mere curio hunter and non-musical collector is not so remunerative as other branches of the shady art of faking. The number of collectors in this branch is comparatively restricted, many of them talented and not easily duped, as is the case in all branches not enjoying popularity. The tourist would rather go home with a painting or a faked bronze of Naples or elsewhere, than carry an instrument he cannot play, which will probably be an encumbrance and dust catcher in the small rooms of big cities. On the other hand, however, there is nothing complicated about this branch of faking. It is usually an easy matter for a guitar or mandolin maker to invest in the small amount of material needed and to turn his hand to the work. It must also be taken into account that these workers are very often repairers of ancient instruments whereby they learn to make their imitations technically correct, though this is by no means always the case. We have, indeed, seen appalling exceptions, pianos of an early period transformed into spinets, lutes with grotesque and impossible fingerboards, etc. Some careless and certainly unmusical imitators go so far as to make instruments that could never be played, and even put common wire instead of gut strings, which makes one wonder what kind of collector it can be who delights in such delusions. Our intention is to deal only with the artistic side of musical instruments, so we lay no claim to the real connoisseurship of musical instruments, more especially as regards the family of stringed instruments which finds its best and most complete expression in the violin. Yet the fact that the great discoveries have generally been made by ignorant men such as Tarisio, not necessarily fine musicians, goes to show that connoisseurship of form has its importance, greatly resembling after all the connoisseurship of other branches in its summing up of various analyses into a final synthesis of form and character. True, in a good violin there is rarely any ornamentation, or if there is, it still more rarely furnishes a clue. But although all is entrusted to simplicity of line and form in its most aristocratic and elemental expression, there still seems to be enough to tell of the touch of a vanished hand. How interesting, justly remarks Olga Raxter, it is to observe an expert spelling out the name of an old fiddle by the aid of this touch of a vanished hand. How eagerly he seeks it and finds it with the help of that alphabet which lies concealed in the colour, shape, height and curves of an old violin. Together with the difficulty of faking instruments, the synthesis of connoisseurship in this line could not be better expressed. As for the quality of the tone, the expert relies purely and simply upon his ear. No book or hints of a practical character can assist the expert to perfect his ear. All depends on natural disposition and the experience of a well-trained organ in this most important part of connoisseurship of musical instruments. When Rossini was asked what is required to make a good singer, he said, 3 things: voice, voice, voice. The quotation fits here, for the chief requirement of a good connoisseur of musical instruments as regards their musical quality consists of a triply good ear. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 24. Velvets, Tapestries and Books. Olla podrida, genuine and faked antique stuffs. The peculiar knowledge necessary to an expert on stuffs. The difficulty in imitating Renaissance velvet. Collectors of costumes. Collections of dolls. Tapestries. Repairs and faked parts or qualities. Book collecting. Two types of book collectors. The faking of editions and rare bindings. The extended and ambitious activity of the art of faking. Faked aerolites. Assembling in this chapter a variety of objects under the title of minor branches of art collecting, we do not use the term artistically, but merely because these branches apparently attract fewer art lovers than the others, and the activity of the faker is more restricted in these cases. In many of these branches, too, the art of collecting and connoisseurship is reduced to technical knowledge, and artistic sentiment plays a very secondary part. If there is any one branch of collecting in which it is necessary to be a specialist to ensure success, that branch is unquestionably antique stuffs. Artistic sentiment and good taste are of comparatively slight assistance compared with technical knowledge, and they may even at times produce two dangerous psychological elements only too often responsible for collectors' blunders: enthusiasm and suggestion. The technician with knowledge of the different qualities of materials, with an eye for the various peculiarities of the weave and colour, and sound information as to the character of the various patterns, etc., is doubtlessly the best equipped as a connoisseur of stuffs. This may sound absurd to the outsider, especially to artists, whom we have ourselves found to be overconfident as to their qualities, their pictorial eye, their full acquaintance with form. Yet too many of these artists, not being collectors or experts, have bought modern goods as antique, old furniture recovered with modern brocade, that no expert would for a moment have taken as being of the same date as the furniture. We refer, of course, to those modern imitations generally the easiest to detect, however artfully they have been coloured and aged to give them the appearance of genuine antiquity. The detection of modern products offers no difficulty to the expert. They may look extremely convincing to the uninitiated or beginner, as they possess what may be termed a general impression of antiquity, but to the trained eye of the expert there are too many essential differences, and they lack above all a character that in the case of a large quantity of stuff, and not a mere sample, is inimitable. For the jacquard machine is not the old weaving loom, the material used is produced with greater care and precision, which gives the fabric a different look even when the coarseness of ancient textiles has been imitated, the colours are different, and so is the chemical process for dyeing the thread, etc. The sum total of these elementary differences, with which the art of imitation cannot cope, is what reveals to the expert almost at sight the antiquity or modernity of the product. In conclusion, with the exception of some rare samples of small pieces, the modern imitation of ancient stuffs is but a successful optical illusion. Imitations that count at least a century of age, on the contrary, prove dangerous puzzles to experts and connoisseurs of this speciality, these imitations having been made in almost exactly the same way as the originals, before weaving machines were invented, and when the thread was spun and dyed in the simple old way before aniline dyes had furnished beautiful but most unstable colours. In France, under Louis XIII, Renaissance patterns were admirably copied, as well as those of the 16th century. The reproduction of old designs is not confined to Italy and France alone. In nearly every country there have been imitations of the best samples of ancient stuffs, damasks, brocades and velvets. As regards imitation, the more complex the pattern in design and colouring, the easier it can be reproduced with success. In fact, plain velvet is the most difficult to imitate. No one, not even in the past, has ever reproduced the fine velvet of the Quattrocento and early Cinquecento with complete success. Methods of aging modern stuff which have not the advantage of the genuine hues of age of old imitations greatly resemble in general lines those adopted to give the appearance of age to other objects. If the colouring is crude and too new looking, the stuff is exposed to atmospheric action, rain, dew and sunshine. Needless to add, this treatment must be followed with care and discrimination, otherwise the fabric may be reduced to a rag as well as to an appearance of age. To harmonize the colours and give them a more faded look, some put the goods in a bath of slightly tinted liquid, thus obtaining on the fabric what in painting is termed velatura. Others put the liquid into an atomizer and steam it onto the stuff. This process has the advantage of giving alternate hues without any sharp delimitation between them. These methods, however, by which the artist can display variation, are not convenient or possible in the case of large quantities of fabric, nor is the result convincing in the proximity of the original. One does not need to be an expert, in fact, to see the difference between the old and the new on a piece of furniture or in a room where imitations have been used to supply what was lacking. To make imitations more convincing, more especially in the case of small pieces, some antiquaries stitch on bands before discolouring the stuff, which are afterwards taken off leaving parts with fresher colours, as often happens in really antique pieces that have belonged to ecclesiastical copes, etc. Strict order having been dispensed with in this chapter, and as, after all, fabrics are involved, we may here touch upon the subject of dress and past costume. The rarity of such collections depends not only upon the fact that the roomy space of a museum is indispensable for their display, but largely upon the scarcity of past century costumes. This branch of collecting is very useful to the history of fashion and national costumes, but it must be considered that to be of interest to the collector a dress must be at least 40 years old, and very few garments attain that age nowadays. Either they are altered to conform to fashion, or unpicked or given away until they have run through the scale of society and end in rags. The rarity of the genuine article appears to correspond with the rarity of collectors of this line, and there is therefore no question of fakes, unless one should take seriously certain comic incidents and consider as a collector the simpleton who buys the cast-off costumes of an elegant fancy dress ball as genuine articles, those poor imitations with no pretence of being anything else, of Henry IV, Marie Antoinette and other historical garments. Having mentioned the subject of costumes, we may speak of another kind of collection that is also very useful to the history of past usages and fashions, that of dolls and toys of past centuries. Dolls and children's toys are not an invention of today. It is safe to say that their existence can be traced almost as far as the history of civilization. The Romans used to bury dolls and toys with the bodies of their little ones or place them in the funereal urn, a usage that has preserved for us specimens of these tiny objects that have drawn smiles from young lips closed and sealed centuries ago. Together with these relics are other images that illustrate the history of costumes like the dolls, the statuettes offered to temples and churches as ex votos, and those used in the construction of the old presepio, Birth of Christ scene, the Christmas Eve representations of the Bethlehem scene. These wooden dolls and statuettes are not only artistic in themselves, but are dressed in stuffs of their epoch very often cut in the fashion of the time. Some of these collections have really been excellent commentaries on the history of fashion and domestic customs of past ages. Among the few important collections we may quote as an example that of Madame Agar, exhibited by this celebrated French artist several years ago in the Palais de l'Industrie, now demolished. Madame Agar's collection was very complete and illustrative of fashion and life in Holland centuries ago. The collection had originally belonged to the infant princess, the daughter of William of Orange and Nassau. Not only was it extremely artistic, containing several interiors of Dutch houses with inmates and accurate details suggesting a painting by Terburg or Teniers, but it represented all kinds of expression of 17th century Dutch life, Madame Agar came into possession of this fine collection under the following circumstances. Returning from one of her artistic tours in Belgium, she visited the city of Ghent and found the collection in the hands of a gentleman to whom she had been introduced upon her arrival. She offered to buy it, but the owner refused all offers, declaring that he did not wish to part with the precious collection. However, after having heard Madame Agar at the theatre one evening, he was so taken by her art that he wrote to the actress the very same night, "Come to fetch my toys, I offer them to you, they are yours." There is no question of fakes in this branch either. The difficulty of finding old stuffs and linen with which to garb the figures is sufficient to discourage the trade, especially when one remembers how few customers the imitator would hope to attract. The art of tapestry weaving is the most complete of the class. Although technique may play its part in constituting expert knowledge, it is certainly subordinate to the artistic qualities necessary to perfect connoisseurship. Faking plays no part in this field, at least not the conspicuous part that it plays in painting and other artistic products likely to attract rich amateurs. This is easily understood when one takes into consideration the time, patience and money needful to the making of tapestry. It costs something like £80 a square yard. The imitator also knows that it would be a waste of time and money to fake old tapestries, as any expert can tell modern work from old. The apparatus has hardly undergone any essential change, it is true, but the materials are so different from formerly that fairly tolerable imitations can only be given in the case of repairs to old pieces. On account of the great cost of modern tapestry, the few existing factories either belong to the state or potentates, or they are supported by the lavish encouragement of some modern Maecenas. As we have said, the difference between the work of modern and ancient tapestry does not lie in a difference of process, unchanged in essentials since the Egyptian dynasties, but rather in the impossibility of obtaining materials like the old ones. Although some unscrupulous dealers do palm off overly repaired pieces of tapestry on foolish novices, the repair of tapestry is no faking after all, for the decorative character of the fabric fully justifies the amending and restoration of missing parts, and, unlike painting, the work does not bear its individual imprint. It is our duty, however, to warn the neophyte that the repairs are very seldom pointed out by dealers and that it is absolutely necessary for the collector to train his eye in order to be able to detect the modern parts from the old and to know how much must be bought as antique and how much as modern. This is not so difficult as it may appear. The modern parts are worked in with the needle, and although the threads have generally been specially dyed, as the usual colours now on sale are very rarely suitable, there is a slight difference in the final effect. Nothing to offend the eye even when closely examined, but enough to warn the expert of the size of the repaired piece. Sometimes the repair of tapestries uses a method which in our opinion comes under the head of faking. This consists of recolouring faded parts with watercolours or tempera. Some of this touching up is really cleverly done, at other times it is so clumsy that one wonders how even a novice can be taken in. If there is any suspicion that the tapestry has been coloured, a practical test is the displacement of the threads with a needle, as the fresh colours are generally laid on with a brush and never penetrate between the threads where the old faded colour is visible. Incredible as it may seem, some tapestries are touched up with pastel. This was sometimes done even in the 18th century to disguise defects and crudeness of tone, and now it is practised to deceive the eye by making a better match between the old and the new parts. Of course pastel work is easily detected if one is allowed to rub the part, but this is not always feasible, especially at public sales where the tapestry is hung on the wall, sometimes very high up, on purpose to defy close inspection. There is also a method of fixing the pastel retouch with an atomizer and a certain liquid sold in Paris, but even these means are not so effective as milk and tempera, and hard rubbing with a white cloth will always reveal the deception when pastel has been used. Rugs, particularly oriental rugs, belong in a way to the same family as tapestry and may be classified with it. There is a difference, however, being less complicated in character and for the most part adorned only with the geometrical patterns and rudimentary arabesques, rugs are imitated with greater facility. Things do not change so quickly in the East as in Western countries, and there the old weaving apparatus is still in use and materials are only just beginning to be imported from Europe. A large field is thus opened up to imitation, and to a certain extent to faking also. It is nevertheless hard to deceive experts and specialists. Keen-eyed and accustomed to distinguish between different kinds and to judge of age, they are also able to detect modern frauds. But, alas, good experts are rare and conceited collectors abound, and for this reason fraud is rampant and remunerative, even in this field. Those buying rugs for the sake of having a collection and not to furnish their houses with a comfortable and highly artistic luxury are advised to place themselves in the hands of an expert. It will save time and trouble. An eclectic collector, however gifted, will rarely consent to go deeply into this branch, as the mastery of it implies great sacrifice of time and the boredom of learning a difficult language, things that prove no obstacle to the passionate lover of the specialty, but tedious and irksome to the general art lover. Following an erratic course in this chapter, we will now pass on to books, manuscripts and autographs, a branch with many devotees and all kinds of collectors, in which trickery and faking find an almost incredibly large sphere of action. Book collectors are of two kinds, the one who prizes the work for the rarity of the edition, and the other who is attracted by the binding. The former is the true book collector, the latter is really only a collector of rare and artistic bindings. The two preferences do not mutually exclude one another, of course, and when found together offer the most complete kind of book collector. It might be imagined that imitations in this branch would be confined to such pieces as only require the faker's shrewdness and imitative skill and not the great amount of work and money demanded by the reproduction of a whole edition, but this is not the case. As soon as fashion, sovereign and despotic in this department also, taste and art being secondary, sets a value on what is called a rare edition, false ones find that the work pays and imitations are thrown upon the market at once. About the end of the 18th century a specialty was made in Lyons of reproducing all the rare editions of Racine's works, while Rouen acquired a certain notoriety in faking old volumes of Molière with every detail carefully and accurately copied, quality of the paper, the type, decorative initials, tailpieces, etc. That the labour was worth the trouble and expense is amply proved by the high prices that some original editions have fetched. The first edition of Molière's works, dated 1669, was sold in Paris for 15,000 francs. At M. Guy Pellion's sale, separate works bearing various dates were sold. Le Tartuffe, 1669, for 2,200 francs. Le Misanthrope for 1,220 francs, and a few volumes below this price. Fashion having set extravagant prices, the original edition of Molière's works was sold at 70 to 100 francs apiece at Bertin's sale, 1885. Old incomplete editions have been completed, and for the late comers not in time for this half-genuine articles, full and first-class imitations are provided. Missing pages of rare volumes, incunabula or precious highly prized editions, are often supplied by the most skilful pen and ink work. It is surprising to see how well the clever calligraphic artist can imitate the printed characters, and how carefully and faithfully the missing pages are copied from some complete edition. In a damaged edition it is generally the frontispiece that is missing, or the ornamental title on the first page. Some of the latter are true works of art and require most artistic penmanship for their reproduction. The illusion is nevertheless often complete. Paulo tells an amusing story of an expert who had not noticed that one of the pages of a certain work was a clever piece of penmanship later added, but to whom the secret was revealed by circumstantial evidence which saved him from being cheated. The work was so admirably done that the expert had not detected it to be penwork till he happened to notice a wormhole in the parchment of that page, whereas the preceding and following pages bore no hole. As it is impossible for a worm to reach a page in the middle of a book without boring through the others, he surmised that the hole must have been there when the page was done, that the page was a later edition in fact. Once suspicious, it is easy to ascertain the truth. A closer examination showed Monsieur Perquet, such was the name of the expert, that the page in question was handwork and not print. It is true that nowadays, by means of photo-mechanical reproductions, old books, characters and illustrations can be imitated to perfection, and there are also mills that can supply all sorts of old-fashioned paper to order, as near as possible to a given sample. Experts claim, however, that such fakes are only dangerous for the inexperienced collector, that a magnifying glass reveals the action of the acid in a sort of scalloped edge to the ink lines, and that, although well imitated, the paper has a different grain when closely examined, etc. But it is, of course, understood that fakes are not as a rule intended to baffle the skill of the expert, but rather to take advantage of the inexperienced. The expert who gives his attention chiefly to the bindings of the books needs to be more of an artist than the other. We know that editions, too, have their elegancy, forms and tasteful simplicity needing, as it were, an artistically trained eye to enjoy their beauty and appreciate their value. But compared with bookbinding their artistic quality seems to be of a more restricted kind. In bookbinding, art in all its decorative eloquence appears to claim full rights. There are bindings of past centuries, more especially in Paris, where bookbinding has always been a grand art, that are really chefs d'œuvre. As usual it is the unwary who in this branch also pays the highest tribute to fakery. From the Grolier bindings down to the last specimens of the 18th century, imitation has a wide field of action for its versatility, but according to experts the most exploited period is that running from the early years of the 17th century to the end of the 18th, one of the most difficult to imitate, and yet one of the most profitable. There are, of course, various ways of faking old bindings. Many have tried to fake the whole, beginning with the fabrication of the ornaments cut into iron, which are used to stamp the gilt ornaments on leather or parchment. In the opinion of the connoisseurs of Paris, where these imitations appear to find their best market, they are far from convincing, being only intended for such as seek a certain decorative quality without pretending to be experts or collectors. Specialists say there are imitations of a far more dangerous character, those composed of various genuinely antique parts, those relying upon some authentic element in the process of making, and original bindings fitted to other books, which thus embellished and enriched fetch higher prices. The first of the above operations knows no limits but those set by the material. It may be a question of using old leather or aged parchment, or of using old labels, or of taking advantage of the characteristic coloured lining papers that modern industry reproduces fairly well. Here we have, in fact, the usual composite style with which a fanciful binding is made or a book put together out of various elements that are perfectly genuine, but belong to different sources. The second manner of faking in decorating the cover of a book is to use some old iron stamps for the impress on the leather of the binding. Some of these old implements that have escaped destruction are now used to advantage, especially to stamp decorative coats of arms on imitation antique bindings, so that the buyer should think the books have come straight from the former library of a nobleman. The faker has used this trick successfully with Americans particularly. In this way the stamps of the Sacré de Louis XV, which are apparently still in existence, have been used as decoys on fine bindings, as well as that of the Rohan Chabot family coat of arms, perpetuating the supposition that books belonging to that illustrious family are still on the market. The third method is called in French rembourtage, and consists, as we have said, of transferring covers from one book to another. There are some good editions that have lost their covers and some worthless books with fine bindings. Fakery repairs this injustice of fate by transferring the good binding to the more meritorious book, a simple act of justice invariably rewarded in the world of fakery by the large sum that can be asked for the edition thus treated. There are naturally many ways to discover the bindings that have in one way or other received the paternal and not at all disinterested caress of the faker. But the best and safest way, shall we ever tire of repeating it, is to train one's eye to that helpful synthesis of judgment called experience. Newly coloured and patinated leather does not stand rubbing with a damp cloth like the old does. Modern gilding and modern stamping imitating antique designs are heavier and less clean cut, as well as not so rich, qualities best understood by comparing modern work with the old, for although the differences are slight they are, nevertheless, plain to the experienced eye accustomed to comparing old and new. Even rembotage, the most difficult to detect, may be found by examining the way one part is joined to the other, the peculiarities of the work, etc. All that can be said, however, to put the neophyte on his guard who may imagine that hints from books or special works on the subject are sufficient to assist him is, go slow, and if you are really anxious to have a good collection and prepared to pay good prices, in the beginning ask the man who knows for his help. Experto crede. It is obvious that no artistic temperament, taste or knowledge of art is necessary in order to become a collector of autographs. This class of collector, who may boast an uninterrupted line from scholars to specialists, has neither the assistance nor complicity of art. Consequently the faker, who inevitably follows suit, must have a knowledge of history in order to avoid historical blunders. He must be acquainted with particulars connected with the personage whose autograph is to be forged, and above all must be an expert imitator of other people's handwriting. In fact, in him the art of forging signatures must be brought to the highest perfection. For here documents are to be forged, a succession of calligraphic characters and idiosyncrasies far more difficult of execution than a mere signature on a false cheque. The aptitude of a bank clerk gives promise of a good expert of this subject. Studies of various papers according to the epoch is not of such assistance here to the expert as in the case of books, for there is still plenty of old-fashioned paper on the market, enough of it at least to bear a few lines from a celebrated man. The chief quality needed is experience gained by comparing originals with forgeries, or better still such familiarity with a given man's handwriting that its genuineness can be judged at sight, as a bank clerk does with a signature. There are some artists also in this class, but not only is it rarer, but their work deals less with autographs properly so called than old documents mostly on parchment with illuminations, etc. Stamp collecting hardly comes within our sphere and represents rather a minor departure of connoisseurship. Several books have been written on the subject, many with valuable hints as to prices and with reproductions of the best samples, etc. We would warn our readers who may perchance be interested that every stamp of value has been faked, that, strange to say, some of these 50-year-old fakes fetch handsome prices, and flourishing factories have been established to supply not only the rare specimens already acknowledged as such, but to produce at a few hours' notice any sample despotic fashion may suddenly raise to the rank of a rarity. Art plays so small a part that the way to become an expert on the subject is to become an expert. Beyond this, which is only in appearance an idem per idem, there is very little to be done. Experience consists of being familiar with the original, the kind of paper used, the colours, peculiarities and also defects, particularly the defects, as when the stamps were printed that are now rare, the art of printing was in its infancy compared with our times. There is no occasion to speak of minor fancy collections that, as usual, form links between the true collector and the man with a mania. Even in these minor branches there may be more than one interesting collection, such, for instance, as that of General Van Damme, who left his relatives no fewer than 60,000 pipes and Baron Oscar de Watteville and others, art plays no great part in these minor expressions of curio collecting, and science also occupies but a limited field. One axiom may be given, however, which holds good for all classes of collecting, whether artistic, scientific or anything else, and that is that as soon as the prices of certain articles come under the nomenclature of fancy prices, through fashion or merit, the faker is ready to hand. In the Paris world of fakers, a larger world than the outsider may imagine, an amusing anecdote is told. Learning the high prices paid by astronomers for bolides, an inveterate faker called upon a well-known chemist to propose a partnership for the production of imitations of meteorites. Even if an invention, the anecdote gives the full size of the faker's spirit of enterprise. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jordan Watts, Oxfordshire. Chapter 25. Summing Up. With some show of reason, Swift affirms that all sublunary happiness consists in being well deceived. We are perfectly aware that this book does not support Swift's ethics of happiness, for while agreeing that the English satirist's theory may hold good on a great many occasions, we claim an exception for collectors as a class. In the world of art, art lovers and collectors, to be well deceived means to be living in a fool's paradise, a most costly dwelling which promises no eternal joy. On the contrary, the happiness derived from being well deceived in this case is generally not only of very short duration, but inflicts smarting wounds to pride and pocket. In the world at large there seems to exist a certain benevolence towards deluded ones, which makes it at times possible for the well deceived to be the only one of his entourage unaware that he has been duped. In the world of collectors such a thing is almost an impossibility, for, to quote a well-known French art lover, "After pictures by Michelangelo and specimens of Medici ware, the rarest thing to find with collectors is kindliness." The same art lover assures that in this peculiar world not only is kindliness, bienveillance, rare, but the opposite sentiment has been developed almost to the point of genius. Collectors, especially first-rate collectors who have finally emerged into fame through the complex resultant of a good eye, shrewdness and extreme skill in fencing with strong competitors, have a regular talent for flavouring bitter pills for deceived friends and comrades with troublesome innuendos and smarting disclosures, for, as the above quoted connoisseur declares, they have a way of praising with praise that exasperates and with homicidal compliments. And there is a type of collector who knows his repertory by heart, a man who is a toreador raffiné, il massacre artistement. What the neophyte can do to avoid being artistically massacred, as the French connoisseur puts it semi-euphemistically, is difficult to say. Books and special treatises may explain the nature of the deceit, point out the dangers awaiting him and show how traps are laid and how they work, but to pretend to become a truly safe buyer on the security of knowledge gathered from books and manuals would be like attempting the ascent of some dangerous peak on the strength of wisdom drawn from works on alpine climbing. The rudiments of the art do not concern so much the knowledge of how to buy as of how not to buy, how to resist, namely, the first impulse, which in an inexperienced art lover proves to be one of the worst dangers. The slow, prudent method must be learned of not listening to first impulses till the first impulses are supported by something better than the innate conceit of a beginner. We know, of course, that there may be occasions when even a beginner may have cause to regret not having listened to a first impulse, but such a thing is further from the general rule than the beginner claims, and in any case it pays in the long run to let a good chance slip rather than risk becoming the possessor of some expensive would-be chef d'œuvre. In addition, during the early stages in particular, a certain amount of scepticism must temper a too ready belief in what the dealer has to say or show, in support of his assertion. There will come a time when experience will help the collector to detect more easily than at first alluring, suggestive information, etc. Naturally, it is not all dealers who are on the watch to take advantage of the beginner. On the contrary, there are more honest dealers in the antique market than one would think, but the trouble is that the dishonest ones seem to be the fore, to be ever there ready to confront the inexperienced novice, and their noisy deceits become far more known than good, honest dealing, causing perplexity in some collectors, so that it may be they disbelieve the man who is telling the truth and give credence to the liar, who, being a perfect master in the art of misrepresentation, seems to be honesty itself. Here, too, the determination to be rather sceptical as to documents, letters, pedigrees and mercantile evidence may lead the beginner to miss some good opportunity, but the case is rare and such losses are as a rule amply covered in the summing up of the total cost of apprenticeship, through not having paid for experience the extravagant price usually demanded. In due time the art lover's ability to discern between dealing and dealing will be sharpened, and he will be able to defend himself better. This merely concerns dealing and experience in distinguishing the genuine from the fake. But even supposing perfection has been attained in this part, the fact does not necessarily imply qualification as a connoisseur, collector, expert, or even simple lover of art. A collection may be composed of genuine articles and yet be a poor one, utterly devoid of artistic merit or even commercial value of importance. To have paid a high price there is no guarantee of merit. There are, as a matter of fact, perfectly genuine paintings for which extravagant fancy prices have been paid, but which in the eyes of a true connoisseur are not worth the nail they hang on. It is almost impossible to conceive that experience in distinguishing the genuine from the false should be acquired without the attainment of some artistic progress prompting discrimination between poor art and mediocre art and fine art, yet this artistic side is the most difficult to develop to that perfection and semi-intuition of the beautiful so necessary to the real and first-rate connoisseur. By what method this artistic side may be perfected in the collector is still more difficult to tell, for in this direction experience only counts to a certain extent. In fact, as regards this artistic education of the connoisseur we are inclined to repeat with Taine, in his Philosophie de l'Art, precepts? Well, two might be given. First, to be born with genius, that is your parents' affair, not mine. Second, to work a good deal to bring it out, and that is not my business either. Here too, then, actual methods are out of the question. They are, perforce, of such a general character as to be no more use than telling a blind man to keep in the middle of the road because there are ditches on either side. It is, further, not uncommon for contrary systems to lead to equally happy results according to the person employing them. One antiquary, when undecided as to the genuineness of a painting, used to have a photograph of it taken, for, he said, he could easily detect the traits of forgery on seeing the work in black and white with all the colours eliminated. Or, to put it in his own words, the faked side sweats out. Another connoisseur held exactly the contrary theory, declaring that he could tell nothing from photos, but needed the colours to help to detect the genuineness or fraud of the painting. Perhaps the former had an artistic temperament based chiefly upon the charm of form, while the latter was what in art is termed a colourist. In addition, at times another misleading cause may be added which comes under the form of intervening suggestion and may put even a highly gifted artistic temperament off the scent. Perhaps an example will best illustrate this peculiar interference, which is not only of a circumstantial order, as we have seen in another part of this book, but may be the result of an unconscious parti pris. Some years ago when Mr. Stanford White imported works of art and antiques for his millionaire patrons, a Mr. X, who owned a fine mansion on Fifth Avenue, very much admired an early 15th century single andiron that was among the imported goods. He wished, however, to have a pair. The suggestion that a modern copy should be made from the only remaining original at first disgusted him, for everyone knows how easily American collectors buy imitations for originals and how disgusted they are if the dealer honestly says that a certain work is an imitation. On being assured that the imitation should be perfect, the new piece was finally ordered, and the antiquary arranged for an artistically exact copy of the ancient andiron to be made in Italy. However, possibly because not wishing to be suspected of concocting modern antiques, or for some other reason, the Italian firm sent a perfect copy of the original in a brand new condition, suggesting that a certain Italian artist living in New York should give it the proper patina, as he was fully initiated in the cryptic art of making new objects look as old as might be desired. The art critic chosen to come and judge of the final result of the work was, as the artist knew, rather distrustful of Italians and their tricks, as he put it. The Italian artist did the work as well as it could be done, and knowing that it was going to be judged side by side with the original, the hardest test that can be inflicted upon an imitation, he managed to cheat the art critic by being excessively frank and honest, taking advantage of his prejudice against Italians and a probable momentary mental attitude. The two pieces were shown in the artist's atelier, the imitation being placed by the artist in the full light and the original in the most benevolent corner, far from the window in a half shade. The first thought that passed through the art critic's brain as he entered the studio was that the tricky Italian had put the imitation where the light was less strong and the shade more benevolently helpful. Very good, he remarked, but of course even when not in the full light an imitation is always an imitation. But that is the original, replied the artist, for to make his positive assertion the more definite, the critic had been pointing to the wrong piece. A stony silence followed. The story ends here and we do not know whether the critic ever forgave the artist his honest trick. Knowing that the art critic was a real connoisseur, a good exception to the class, we are quite sure that his judgment was perverted by the preconceived notion that the Italian had placed the imitation in the shade and thus had hardly let his artistic temperament and knowledge of art come into play in forming an opinion, or rather the opinion was already formed and too quickly expressed by a semi-subconscious process of reasoning that had nothing in common with art judgment. So many are the special cases and so little the assistance generally given to newcomers that the safest method in conclusion is to have no actual method, to watch and study one's own temperament, value the first results objectively, to be ready to learn as much as possible from experience under whatever form it comes and finally, like in so many cases of human life and possibilities, to work out one's own salvation. In this way, even if not called to the Olympus of the elect, the art lover will certainly reduce his bad bargains to a minimum. Bad bargains in the way of buying the wrong things as far as the genuineness of the article is concerned, as well as with regard to its artistic worth. With this he must rest satisfied, for, as we gladly repeat once more with the Nestor of French connoisseurs, beware of the collector who never makes a mistake. The strongest is he who makes the fewest mistakes. As we have seen, the genus Curieux, curio hunter, comprises a most complex and multiform assembly of types. From the distinct ages of Roman dominion down to our times, collectomania has produced characters graduated in originality from the grotesque to the tragic, the false to the genuine, the sordid or wicked like Mark Antony and Verres to noble representatives like Julius Caesar, Augustus and Agrippa. Curiously enough, the noble type of collector and the usefulness of his mission have generally escaped the observation of writers of all ages. They seem to have been quicker to see the grotesque side of collectomania than its utility. Martial, Yuval, Pliny, Seneca and others are not dissimilar in their remarks from, say, Molière and La Bruyère. So strong is the inclination to place the types in a grotesque setting, to make them the target of witty sallies, that they very often mistake oddities for signs of idiocy, idiosyncrasies and peculiarities for craziness, and, carrying their analysis no further, they let loose the vein of their satire on people whose passion for collecting has been of extreme use to the intellectual world, greatly assisting progress and the civilization of humanity. Just like a donkey beholding a lyre, jibes an old Greek epigram in allusion to collectors who, while buying eagerly, give so little time, or none at all, to the enjoyment of the artistic merits of their acquisitions. Addressing one of his contemporaries who had a passion for collecting manuscripts and volumes but no inclination to read them, Lucian remarks, "Why so many literary works? Do you collect them in order to lie on the learned thoughts of others, or to paste the parchment of the volumes to your skin? With it all you will not become a jot more learned, a monkey is always a monkey, even though covered with gilded garments." To follow up the special case of book collecting to which Lucian's remark casually leads us, the same sentiment as that of the Greek writer was entertained centuries later by Petrarch and Robert Estienne. The former was a poet and bibliophile, the latter a famous printer, author of the Thesauros Linguae Latinae. The two did not spare satires on the mere collector of books. A like attitude is taken towards Mazarin by a mediocre poet of La Fronde, who reproaches the cardinal with collecting books without reading them, the same reproach that contemporary writers make to Magliabechi, a passionate collector of rare editions who never went further in a book than the title page. Yet to confine ourselves to these alone, to Mazarin is due one of the finest libraries of Paris which still bears his name, and by his careful patient work Magliabechi was the founder of the Magliabeciana, now the National Library of Florence, a marvel and model of historical character to other more modern institutions of the kind. These two persistent and passionate book collectors have certainly contributed more to science and its progress than many of those scholars who made fun of their hobby. It must be taken into consideration that collecting, after all, is a passion, at times a deep and firmly rooted one, and that passion, like love, in its most exalted expression does not represent normality, but while on the one hand presenting qualities of an intuitive character, can be coupled with oddities and idiosyncrasies, frequently the inevitable heritage of originality. Hannibal, who stored his money in the hollow of the bronze statues of his collection, Sulla, who put to death citizens to seize their rare pieces of art, and Julius Caesar, who travelled with his cherished objects of virtu, are known to us as collectors mostly through their peculiarities, the amusing anecdotal side of a passion, certain to be exploited by a writer, be he chronicler or historian. Yet to go back to the unjustified and indiscriminating spirit of satirists, both of ancient and more recent times, which tends to consider the collector a maniac or fool, many a Greek or Roman chef d'œuvre of art has nevertheless been spared to our admiration by the patient persistence and art-loving care of collectors. It would indeed be interesting to follow the passage of some of the most noted specimens of past art. If one could trace the true history of each one of these objects in all its details, it would perhaps give us the history of the collecting passion, together with the tangible proof of its merits and utility. It would, indeed, not only be interesting but also instructive to know the vicissitudes of some of the works of art that have come down to us. The few hints existing as to the lineage of owners of some of the most famous pieces of Greek and Roman art certainly promise interest, even though marred at times by the fact that much of the information rests upon the vague authority of tradition, or is strongly doubted by modern criticism. We owe, it is more than possible, the Venus of the Hermitage to Caesar, the well-known Weta has almost certainly been saved to our admiration by Lucullus, just as Cicero may be thanked for the Demosthenes, and the collecting passion of Sallust has handed down to us the Faun, the Hermaphrodite, and the vase of the Villa Borghese. These remarks of a well-known French collector who mainly notes works contained in the Louvre Museum might be extended to many other collections, especially those of Rome, where several of the works of art have old historical records of undisputed character. From the Renaissance down to our own days, the pedigrees of celebrated works of art are not only surer, but present at times a less interrupted line of descent. With such it is not uncommon to find a rare object pass from one collector to another, receiving the same care and consideration as though passing from father to son as a cherished heirloom, and it is, in fact, passing from one to another member of the same family, the family bound by an identical burning passion, that of collecting. As to the essence of this passion, so often confounded with mania, a mistake calling forth the following comment from a French collector: "Confondre la manie avec la curiosité, c'est prendre l'Istrie pour l'amour, la belle Hélène pour l'Iliade." We should like to quote Gersaint, one of the few men who as art dealer and collector in one might be styled private dealer in modern phrase, impersonated the passion, as we have said, in its highest expression among the many collectors of the 18th century. It must be understood, of course, that Gersaint, one of these maniacs in, say, La Bruyère's opinion, was a representative of those passionate collectors who subordinate every other passion of mankind to the one they have made the sole aim of their lives. A curieux, says this unilateral lover, but not hobbyist collector, has the advantage of not falling an easy prey to the many passions so familiar to the human family. The curiosité fills as the empty spaces of his leisure moments. Entertained by his cherished possessions, he has time only for working the advantage of his curiosité, and his cabinet becomes the centre of all his pleasures, and the seat of all his passions. The outsider and half-way insider will agree that this is a trifle too much. But after all, the great collectors who have left to the museums of their countries fortunes that would have been lost but for their intense passion, treasures of art left by the ignorant to the doom of decay, have all felt, more or less, the burning passion described by Gersaint, in the passage quoted, which goes on to assert that a true paradise awaits the perfect collector, who is never bored and never the prey of spleen. Without discussing the promises held out by Gersaint as the perfect collector is, to our knowledge, rare, let us state that our book does not hope to urge any reader on to the perfection that ushers into Gersaint's bliss. But if the brief glimpse we have given of collectomania with its pleasures and dangers should convince some really passionate lover of art that collecting has a nobler aim than that of mere pleasure, if we should discourage a Tongilius or Paulus, or if this work should scare some modern Clarinus and do away with a noisy, useless, up-to-date Trimalchus, we shall feel that the purpose of the book has been justified to some extent. End of chapter 25 and part 3, and end of The Gentle Art of Faking by Riccardo Nobili.